500 miles north of Moscow, in -45-degree weather, 47 American troops took refuge in bunkers cut from the frozen tundra. Just before daybreak on January 19, 1918, as flares and rockets lit the horizon, Lieutenant Harry Meade was tasked with holding the Americans' forward position directly outside the small village of Ust-Padenga. Pinched on 3 separate sides, the 29-year-old platoon leader knew his men were exhausted, homesick, and vastly outnumbered. As the sun broke over the eastern mountaintops, the first shell of an hour-long, unrelenting artillery barrage sent shockwaves through the crisp morning air. Even the cessation of this bombardment would bring no relief due to the Bolshevik Red Army, fatigued in mono-white uniforms, leapt from camouflage positions and charged the Americans. Lieutenant Meade recalls, "I at once realized that our position was hopeless. We were sweeping the enemy line with machine gun and rifle fire. As soon as one wave of the enemy was halted on one flank, another was pressing in on us from the other side. The Americans retreated, becoming little more than shadows, weaving through small, abandoned village houses and mounds of soil chewed up by artillery fire. Each new dash leaving more of our comrades lying in the cold and snow, never to be seen again." Upon arrival to the next, more fortified village, the 47-man platoon had suffered 15 injuries and 25 deaths. Only 7 Americans had endured the incursion unscathed. During the height of World War I, political and social revolutions inside the Russian Empire resulted in the abolishment of Russia's monarchy in favor of a socialist government. The fight for this achievement was only won through a bloody civil war that spanned between 1917 and 1923. World War I was taking heavy tolls on the Russian army, creating a plethora of complaints against the leadership of Tsar Nicholas II and the entire Romanov family. The Tsar had overstepped his limits in 1915 as he would assume full control over the Russian Imperial Army. Immense casualties, far beyond tactical projection, had left much of the Russian army mutinous, directly blaming the devastating losses on the inexperienced directives of Tsar Nicholas. Only compounding the unrest, Tsarina Alexandra, the wife of Tsar Nicholas, was left to rule in his absence. The Tsarina was German-born, however, leading to rumors of collusion. These only grew exponentially as her relationship with mystic Grigory Rasputin became more apparent. Rasputin would grow to have great influence and control over decisions made by Alexandra, thus heavily impacting the corruption and growing dissent within Russia. The war had left citizens lacking in almost every aspect of basic needs. The massive disruption to agriculture created a devastating food shortage. This, when paired with extreme inflation, pushed the cost of any available food to unimaginable levels. The Russian government, under the rule of Tsarina Alexandra and indirect influence of Grigory Rasputin, printed millions of ruble notes to finance the war effort. This caused market prices to rise 4 times higher than 1914, only 3 years prior. With little increase to wages, farmers were forced to hoard their grain and crops, only further increasing the strain on cities' food supplies and subsequently, yet again, increasing prices. For 2 months, beginning in January of 1916, German-funded propaganda would spread throughout Russia, resulting in widespread criticism of the government and the formation of small revolutionary parties, individual groups of disgruntled workers that sought change in their ruling class. During this time, Russian Chairman Alexander Guchkov would call upon the Central War Industries Committee and senior army officials to abdicate the Tsar through force. 11 months later, an organized group of Russian nobility would assassinate Rasputin and approach the Tsar's cousin, Grand Duke Nicholas, with a proposal. The Duke was indirectly questioned of his ability to inherit the throne should anything happen to Tsar Nicholas II. As the war raged on throughout the world, many soldiers of the Russian army turned against their leadership. Many in power who swore loyalty to the Tsar were quietly killed and replaced by either disgruntled citizens or conscripts who had little, if any, loyalty left to the Tsar. On March 16, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, under immense pressure politically and even fearing for the life of his family as well as his own. The emperor renounced his throne. A provisional government was set in place under the initial leadership of Georgy Lvov, but would soon change to Russian lawyer Alexander Kerensky, who pledged to continue fighting the German offensive on the Eastern Front. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson and the Allied powers had supplied Russia since the beginning of the war in 1914, but had been hesitant to join forces with Tsar Nicholas II. Under Kerensky's provisional government, however, Wilson agreed to provide economic and technical support. Regardless of support or leadership, the war was becoming increasingly unpopular throughout the world. This was never more apparent than inside Russia itself. Unrest in the populace had spread throughout the country, and a man by the name of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, a renowned Marxist, would form the anti-war Bolshevik Party. Better known as Vladimir Lenin, the political theorist Bolshevik Party garnered instantaneous support within Russia, as immense numbers of Russian soldiers mutinied or deserted the imperial army. The Kerensky Offensive, also known as the July Offensive or the Galician Offensive, began on July 1, 1917, and would lead to the entire collapse of the Eastern Front. A German and Austro-Hungarian counterattack would absolutely decimate Russian forces. Despite this failure, Kerensky would assume control of the army as commander-in-chief a few short weeks later on July 19th. Lar Kornilov, Kerensky's predecessor, would in turn attempt to create a military dictatorship by starting a coup. With the support of British Brigadier General Alfred Knox, Kornilov would arrange for an armored car squadron to overthrow Kerensky's regime. This, however, would fail. It wouldn't be until October 26th that Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, with German aid, would organize the assault and seizure of the Winter Palace, the official residence of Russia's leadership. With a force of 40,000 soldiers, Lenin revolutionists laid siege to the palace at 10:25 p.m. The grounds, which were merely guarded by 3,000 Russian cadets, officers, Cossacks, and female soldiers, had fallen by 2 a.m., less than 4 hours later. Alexander Kerensky had, however, already fled the fortress. On March 3, 1918, Russia, alongside the Central Powers, would sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, putting an end to Russian involvement in World War I. The United States and all Allied powers felt a betrayal from their once ally, as the rest of the world was still deep in conflict. As well as this betrayal, a new concern began to arise. With the treaty signed, Germany now posed a real threat of achieving total European domination. Russian supplies could now flow freely through Europe and even reach German fortifications throughout the continent with ease. Among this, Allied powers were also heavily invested in Russia at this point, still holding large amounts of supplies and equipment in their Russian ports. With the Eastern Front in shambles and Russia removing their support, both British and French officials weighed the cost of military intervention in the region. Tactically, finding a net positive result, the decision was made to deploy, with the intent only to restore the Eastern Front against Germany. On March 4, 1918, one day after the treaty had been signed, British troops landed at the port of Murmansk, Russia, to find themselves in the middle of a Russian civil war between the newly formed Bolshevik government, led by Vladimir Lenin, and various anti-Bolshevik units, and even a volunteer army. 1 month later, against the advice of the United States Department of War, President Woodrow Wilson agreed to deploy 5,000 American troops to aid British and French operations. These 5,000 soldiers would come to be known as the American North Russia Expeditionary Force, or the Polar Bear Expedition for short. Another 8,000 American infantrymen stationed in the Philippines and Camp Fremont, California, were also deployed in Russia's administrative city of Vladivostok. Japan, concerned about their northern borders, sent 70,000 troops in total. These, as well as 50,000 Romanian, 23,000 Greek, and 11,000 Estonian troops, among others, gave aid to the Allied positions being established on Russia's northern front. On September 4, 1918, led by Colonel George Stewart, the first of the promised American battalions arrived in the Murmansk region of northern Russia. While the Americans were primarily bolstering positions and planning their campaign, British and French forces advanced through the frozen terrain. On December 11th, a detachment of anti-Bolshevik troops fighting alongside allies were sent to the North Russia front lines and mutinied, completely abandoning their position. British General William Ironside even ordered the execution of the ringleaders involved in the mutiny. In February of 1919, Allied powers would advance south, capturing small villages and settlements that were scattered across Russia's expansive tundras. In the first significant confrontation between American troops and the Bolshevik army, Allied powers would meet harsh opposition upon reaching the town of Sageja. In this attack, half of the Red Army garrison was either dispatched or taken prisoner. Despite harsh terrain and Bolshevik counterattacks, Allies would continue their unrelenting push south, capturing 3,000 square miles of territory. By September, much of the Murmansk region was under the control of Allied powers. A final offensive was planned to capture the remainder of Murmansk, with only the Bolshevik villages of Koikari, Usana, and Konchazero standing in their way. However, Red Army fortifications at both Koikari and Usuna were far stronger than anticipated, and their advances failed. Extreme casualties were felt by all participating forces on behalf of the Allied powers, so much so that it resulted in an order for total evacuation of the region. Only a few short weeks after feeling victory within their grasp, Murmansk was totally abandoned, with the last Allied troops leaving on September 27th. 1 month prior to evacuating Murmansk, 8,000 additional American troops alongside 7,000 Japanese and 1,800 British deployed to the east in Siberia. By September 5th, Italian, French, and Czech units also joined the effort in re-establishing the Eastern Front. The combined forces pushed west, occupying all major towns and ports east of the city of Chita, while the majority of Allied forces continued to push west on the front lines at Omsk. Japanese troops, with their own orders, declined to advance beyond Lake Baikal. The Americans, wary of Japanese intentions, opted to stay behind, as well as to keep an eye on them. The Americans, wary of Japanese intentions, opted to stay behind as well to keep an eye on them. By October, British forces who had continued advancing west had made it to Omsk and took shelter there from the harsh Siberian winter for the next 6 months. However, these operations, much like northern Russia, would be halted by the Red Army. A massive counterattack which had formed at the city of Perm decimated both Allied forces as well as the anti-Bolshevik troops that had pushed so far in the months prior. The now minuscule British force evacuated in the summer of 1919, leaving only American and Japanese troops holding fortifications in the territory they had recently claimed. By 1920, all remaining Allied forces had left not only Siberia, but the whole of Russia. The Japanese would follow in 1922. Political scientist Frederick Schumann expressed his belief that these American campaigns on Russian territory forever soured potential relations between the two giants, and may have even contributed to the origins of World War II and later the Cold War.